Canada's balance sheet is the envy of the world, and it means we have the fiscal firepower to respond. We're now prepared to use it. We'll provide $27 billion of direct support to people and businesses, which is more than 1% of our GDP. On top of this, we'll defer $55 billion in tax revenue, leaving that money in the economy.
Welcome back to CBC News' special coverage of the coronavirus pandemic. I'm Vashi Kapelos. That was Finance Minister Bill Morneau announcing earlier today the federal government's so-called triggering of its fiscal firepower, as he terms it. How much impact could it have, and will opposition parties support the moves? Andrew Scheer is, of course, leader of the Conservative Party. He joins us now from Regina. Hi, Mr. Scheer. Thanks for making time for us.
You bet. Good afternoon.
I want to start off just by asking you, because the minister and other ministers have raised the prospect of the House coming back in order to vote on some of what was proposed today. Do you know, or do you have any kind of timeline of when that might happen?
We're in discussions with the government. We've indicated our support for that. We believe that in this time frame, when people are going through the hardship in real time, that Parliament has to react very quickly. We don't yet have an exact date on that, but the impressions we've been given from all the other parties, including the government, is that there's a willingness to do this very quickly. So we're going to continue to be cooperative in those efforts to get Parliament back so that we can take the necessary steps to get assistance directly into the hands of Canadians who are going through so much hardship right now.
Let's talk about the assistance that was proposed by the government today. Basically $27 billion, as they put it, in direct help for Canadians, another $55 billion in tax deferrals. What is your initial impression of the package they announced?
Well, Conservatives are always supportive of measures that will put money right in the hands of Canadians. So there's a lot here that we think will help. We are going through some of the finer details. Of course, it's our job to make sure that we provide that oversight. We're also going to be asking questions about some people who may, fall through the cracks, or that this package doesn't adequately reach, as well as we have some additional measures that we'd like to propose. For example, some of the assistance that was announced previously in terms of loans for small businesses. Right now, those loans are subject to interest rates that start off at 5%. That could be a big burden for small businesses to add on to any existing debt load that they're carrying. So we're going to be asking questions about whether or not there's a capacity to address that, as well as making sure that people who have had shifts canceled, people who are in precarious work or who don't have regular hours, will be able to access some of these programs as well.
Let me just parse that out a little bit. When you started off, you said people that it might not adequately reach. Specifically, who would you be referring to there?
Well, as we're going through the details of this announcement, that's the lens we're looking at it through, to say, okay, this is, people who qualify for GST rebates will be receiving extra supplement, people who qualify for the child tax benefit. But remember, those qualifications, people who meet those thresholds, are based on last year's income statement. So we've seen some catastrophic drops in revenue, both on the individual side for people as well as for small businesses. So they may be in a situation where they will qualify for that next year because they've gone through such hardship already, but that they won't be showing up on the government's register for qualifying based on last year's numbers. So those are the types of things that we're looking through it. We're going to be proposing solutions as we identify them to the government, so that next week, when Parliament does come back, we can be as comprehensive as possible, recognizing that this is a very fluid situation, that there will likely need to be adjustments made depending on how long this crisis lasts.
Yeah, let me ask you about the fluidity of that situation. And I had the minister on a little bit earlier asking Minister Blair about whether this is, as I think some of the members of the government said, almost a first step. Are you supportive, as leader of the Conservative Party, of additional money going out the door, if necessary, going forward?
Well, let me first say that this is an unprecedented situation, and Conservatives always believe that the government should be there for emergency situations, for when people are in hardship through no fault of their own, and that is what we're dealing with here. small businesses, restaurants, they've been ordered not to open. So there's a lot of people going through hardship, not because they made a poor decision, but because they are really victims of a global pandemic. So we absolutely do support the government being there. I do take issue with some of the things that the finance minister said about the capacity that the government has to respond. Remember, we're entering into this crisis with massive deficits, with much reduced capacity to act. And so we've been critical of the government's deficits for the past 4 or 5 years, because we do believe that the government should be paying down debt when times are good, so that when a crisis like this hits, we have maximum flexibility to react. But in general, we want to help people. We recognize that people have had shifts canceled, that their businesses have been closed, and they're worried about rent payments and mortgage payments and utility payments. So we do want to see the government step in this time of emergency.
Let me just, if you don't mind, play devil's advocate for a second, because on that issue of fiscal capacity, that is something that we've heard quite often from the federal government. I know that your party has taken issue with the sort of level of the deficit over the past few years. They do insist that their debt to GDP ratio is the lowest of the G7. That's not wrong. They do end up, even according to the PBO, have up to $40 billion of wiggle room. This might end up surpassing that, to be fair, but they do have that wiggle room. Even the PBO says it. Is it? Are they really wrong?
Well, here's what we're going to experience, where they like to point to this relative term of debt to GDP, but GDP is going to shrink drastically. So that number is going to spike. Who knows how high it'll go as this crisis goes on. What I can tell you in real dollars, they've added tens of billions of dollars to the deficit, to the national debt. That is reduced capacity. If they hadn't been running deficits for the past 4 or 5 years, we would have even more latitude to help people. We're in the early days of this crisis. Just last week, the government was saying that they weren't going to restrict travel. They weren't going to close borders. Now they are. So this is obviously an escalating situation, and we're already talking about $85 billion worth of government spending, and it's needed, and it's going to help people, and so we're going to be supportive of that. But this is why messages around fiscal responsibility are so important.
Doesn't, though, sometimes fiscal responsibility, and I'm not in any way taking away from the concept, but I look, for example, to Alberta right now that did make some of those spending decisions. And as a result, they're having to reverse them now because they would have decreased capacity, let's say, in the healthcare sector. Sometimes when you make those decisions in the name of fiscal responsibility, you end up with diminished capacity to fight something like the pandemic we're seeing right now.
Well, we were very prescriptive with where we thought the government was spending money unwisely, and we put that forward, and we have been doing that. Right now, it's important to remember those types of things, those lessons in the past, to help guide us in the future. Here we are today now in the world in which we live. So we are going to be supportive of measures to help Canadians get through this difficult time. We can have those conversations about what to do when things return to normal. One of the things that we are going to be focused on is to ensure that these are measures that are targeted during this time of crisis and perhaps some period of time afterwards, as people might suffer from the effects of this beyond when the pandemic no longer poses a threat. There will still be long-lasting economic repercussions. But we want to make sure the government's response is very targeted to this period of time, to things that are related to this pandemic and the government directives that have flowed from it.
Quickly, before I let you go, and I know in the grand scheme of things, this is not what is on the minds of every Canadian necessarily, but the race to replace you, the Conservative Party leadership race, a number of candidates have expressed a desire to see it put on hold, just given the circumstances. Do you have a position one way or the other on that?
We're going to have some conversations as a national council and as a leadership committee, as this is a dynamic, fluid situation for government. So, of course, it's our own party is going to have to adapt. There are certain wheels set in motion, and making a change has to be done very carefully. We want to treat all candidates with respect, and we want to make sure that there's a level playing field. And deciding to do something or not to do something can have a benefit or an impact on that race. So we have to be very, very careful as to what we do with that. We're looking at options, of course, and I would just encourage anybody who has some concerns about that to let their national councillors hear from them so that National Council can make an informed decision.
Any idea when that decision might come down?
We're in regular contact. We're not having face-to-face meetings, as you can imagine, but we are in constant contact with conference calls regularly in the leadership committee, which is a subset. It's not all of our party's national council. They are in regular contact. I have been kept up to speed on some of the nature of the conversation, and as you've seen, different governments react. We're going to be responding to the events that are happening in real time as best as we can as a party.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Scheer, for making time for us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Conservative Party leader Andrew Scheer from Regina.
Both Canada and the United States will temporarily restrict all non-essential travel across the Canada-US border.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau confirming there a tweet sent earlier this morning by U.S. President Donald Trump. He tweeted that non-essential travel between our two countries would be prohibited. That was the first big COVID-19 news today, coming before the $82 billion package announcement, economic package announcement. Jagmeet Singh is the leader of the federal NDP. He joins us now from Toronto to get reaction to that announcement. Hi, Mr. Singh. Thanks for making time for us.
Hi there, how are you?
Good. I just wanted to start off before we get into the details of this announcement and your reaction. I know that you had initially tweeted, I think it was last week, that you weren't feeling well, so you went into self-isolation for a few days. Where do things stand? How are you feeling?
Yeah, I feel great. I was just facing a minor cold, and on the advice of my doctor, he said it's best to avoid exposure to the public, to limit contact with the public, and I followed his advice. I am healthy, hale, and in good shape. But it's actually an important thing that all people, as much as possible, reduce contact, social distance, and stay home if possible. It's incredibly important to flatten the curve to stop the spread of the illness.
So when it comes to what the federal government announced today, I remember last Friday when they had initially announced that $10 billion in credit and money for the provinces. Your party and you yourself, I believe on Twitter, highlighted immediately that it didn't include, for example, people who need to take sick days because of the reasons you just outlined. You took a few days to stay at home, but weren't necessarily covered by their employer. Today, there is money set up for them. Is it to your satisfaction?
Well, the Prime Minister and the Liberal government took some good measures and some good steps today. My concern is what I'm hearing from people is that they're worried about the delay of how long it's going to take for them to access those supports. There's people that we know right now are not able to work, don't have the ability to earn any income, and have bills to pay. And so they need supports, and they're worried about how long it's going to take to be able to get some of that financial support directly to the people who need it most.
So I had Mr. Blair on earlier in the show. I asked him about that because you're right, to a degree at least. It is, I've heard from a lot of people who are worried about waiting until April. This would require a massive technical capacity that probably the system has not seen before. Is it understandable to you that it's going to take some time for something this major to make its way through the system so that people can get that money?
Well, I just know that people need help right away. And so what I've offered to the Deputy Prime Minister was that New Democrats are prepared to fast-track any legislation that will ensure that money flows to people who need it most, working people, small businesses, people who need direct financial supports right now. We are prepared to do whatever it takes to pass that type of legislation. And we want to see, with that commitment, we're hoping that we can see applications open up as soon as possible so that families that are in need, people that are in need, young people that are in need can see those supports or at least start to apply for those supports right away. We've seen other countries take really drastic steps in the face of this crisis and provide direct financial supports right away. We need to see that as well. So while I'm encouraged by the measures, which seem very positive, I'm still worried that people are really feeling the pressure of not being able to get that financial support right away.
So when you talk about, Mr. Singh, direct financial support, are you saying you want the government to write everybody a check?
Well, I know that people are right now worried about being able to pay the bills. And we need to figure out a way to be able to give people supports. And there's been some changes that have been announced around increasing access to GST rebates and increasing the amount, as well as changes that will allow people who are not covered by the current EI system to be covered. Those are good, but we've seen other countries do incredible things to provide supports directly to people that are impacted. And I want us to keep all those options on the table. I want to see people get help right now. And I know people are hurting. and there is so much that we can do. And I just want to make sure the government knows that New Democrats are prepared to work together to deliver those supports right away as quickly as possible to people who need it.
I just want to make sure I understand. Are you saying that you would offer some sort of amendment to what they introduced so that there are more direct payments? And by that, I mean, a check that's being mailed to people? Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying is that people need help right away. And whatever that metric is, whatever that method is to provide that support, we've seen other countries do it. And that we're prepared to work with the government to pass any legislation needed to ensure that that happens. If people need help right now, and if the government needs some support to pass legislation to make that happen, New Democrats are prepared to do that. We know that the current proposals will help, and they're good, but I'm still concerned about how long it's going to take, because people are telling me that they're worried about being able to pay their bills. Some people have already been laid off of work. Some people have already had to stay home and have no place to work because their place of work has shut down or has reduced hours. And so we know people are hurting right now, and I want to make it very clear that I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make sure those people get direct supports as quickly as possible.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.